The sky was still gray when she stepped outside. Not the kind of gray that promises a storm, but that soft, lingering gray that makes everything uncertain. Like the world hasn't quite made up its mind yet. The air was cool, just enough to make her pull her sweater closer. A few leaves skittered across the sidewalk like they weren't sure where they were going. And in a way, neither was she. Maybe you've had mornings like that too. Mornings where even getting out of bed felt like an act of blind courage, where the day ahead felt like a hallway with no lights and you were just groping around hoping your hands would land on something solid. That's the kind of morning we're talking about today. The kind of life moment where sight fails and only one thing is left: faith. Faith is a word we say easily in good times. When the prayers are answered, when the bills are paid, when the diagnosis comes back clear. Faith is light and effortless. But real faith, the kind that stretches you, the kind that tests you, is born in the dark. It's born in the fog, when nothing makes sense and the road ahead is invisible. It's born when the job falls through, the relationship ends, the door stays shut, and your hands are empty, but your heart is still whispering, keep going. That kind of faith, the walk by faith kind, is what we're talking about today. Because there are times when we pray and feel no answer. We knock and no door opens. We fast and still feel forgotten. And it's in those very moments that the enemy wants to whisper, you're alone. God isn't listening. Stop walking. But I want to meet that voice today with something stronger. I want to meet it with a truth that has carried generations through deserts, storms, wars, and wilderness. A truth that says walking by faith does not mean walking without fear. It means walking anyway, despite it. The early morning fog outside your window may blur your view, but that doesn't mean the sun has vanished. It's still there, behind the haze. And just because you can't see the outcome, the healing, the solution, or the finish line, that doesn't mean God has stopped moving. That's what this message is about. It's for the soul who's still walking with swollen feet, still showing up even when hope feels small, still praying even when silence is all they hear. If that's you, this message is for you. So let's begin with the foundation of it all. The truth that faith begins where sight ends. You may be familiar with that passage from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, for we walk by faith, not by sight. That's 2 Corinthians 5:7. And it isn't just a slogan for Christian t-shirts. It's a survival guide for every season where God's voice goes quiet. Paul doesn't say we walk by feelings, or by logic, or by popular opinion. He says we walk by faith, which means there will be seasons, long seasons, when you won't see the next step, and you'll have to move anyway. Faith, by definition, only exists where sight stops. As St. Augustine once said, faith is to believe what you do not see. The reward of this faith is to see what you believe. That's the paradox we're invited to live in. The more we surrender to what we can't see, the more clearly we begin to witness God's hand at work in ways we could have never planned. But that doesn't make it easy. It's not easy when your prayers have gone unanswered for months, maybe years. It's not easy when the business you built starts collapsing and your family depends on you. It's not easy when you're trying to conceive and every test says, not this time. It's not easy when you stand at the grave of someone you beg God to save. This kind of faith, gritty, aching, tear-stained faith, it's not poetic, it's raw. And it often feels more like letting go than holding on. I think of people I've met or spoken with over the years, their stories echoing in my heart like distant hymns. There was a man in Dublin who, after losing his wife of 32 years, still went to daily mass. Not because he didn't miss her, but because in the hollow silence of the pew, he felt closest to her. There was a single mother in Detroit who worked 2 jobs, never knowing how she'd pay rent, but who wrote verses from Isaiah on sticky notes and put them on her bathroom mirror just to remind herself, I am not forsaken. And there was a retired teacher in a small village outside Athens who, after being diagnosed with Parkinson's, started every morning with the same prayer. God, let me still be useful today. None of them had clarity, none of them had guarantees, but all of them walked. That's faith. We like to think faith means confidence, certainty, maybe even joy. But in Scripture, faith often looks more like obedience. Noah built an ark with no rain. Abraham walked up a mountain to sacrifice the son he prayed decades for. Mary said yes, with no idea where it would lead her. And it led her to a manger, a cross, and an empty tomb. The common thread between them wasn't comfort, it was surrender. And maybe that's the hardest part about faith. It requires release. It requires us to unclench our fists and let go of the plan we were so sure of. The timeline we thought was perfect, the solution we believed was best. It asks us to trust not in what we can calculate, but in who God is. So if you're in a season of confusion, I want to remind you, confusion is not the absence of God's presence. It's often the evidence of His refining. You're not being abandoned, you're being aligned. He's removing the need for sight so He can strengthen your faith. And that kind of faith isn't weak, it's indestructible. Now, I know some of you are thinking, but how do I walk when I can't see the path? Let me offer something simple yet powerful. Walk one, so step at a time. Don't wait to feel fearless. Don't wait to have all the answers. Just move in the direction of your last clear yes. If God told you to stay, stay. If He told you to apply, apply. If He told you to forgive, forgive. That's walking by faith, one obedient step at a time. One woman once told me, I don't think I'm brave. I think I'm just too stubborn to give up on what God started. And I smiled, because that's exactly the kind of faith Jesus applauded in the Gospels. Not flashy faith, not polished faith, but persistent faith. The widow who kept knocking, the man who lowered his friend through the roof, the woman who touched the hem of his garment. None of them had certainty. All of them had faith. So what does walking by faith look like in real life? It looks like sending the job application even when you're tired of rejection. It looks like going to the doctor even when you're afraid of the results. It looks like starting over in a new city, a new country, a new life, without knowing a soul, but knowing your God. It looks like showing up to church even when your heart is numb. It looks like praying for the same miracle every day, even when the answer hasn't come. It looks like believing, not because you see, but because you trust the one who does. And if today all you have is enough strength to whisper, God, help me take one more step, that's enough. That is faith. You are walking. You are not stuck. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. You are being led. Even if the path looks like wilderness, because the God who led Israel through the desert, who led Peter across the waves, who led Paul through shipwrecks and prisons, that same God is still leading you. You don't need to see the finish line to keep going. You don't need confirmation to take action. You don't need applause to know you're doing the right thing. You only need one thing, the decision to trust. Faith begins where sight ends, and that beginning, it's more powerful than you realize. Let me close this part with this thought. Maybe today isn't about getting to the mountaintop. Maybe it's just about not turning back. Maybe today your victory isn't in triumph, though it's in movement. It's in saying, I don't see the way, but I trust the God. And that brave, quiet, unseen kind of movement is what God honors. That's where miracles begin, not always in the lightning. Often in the simple steps, the tearful prayers, the trembling yes. That's the real ground of faith. And if you're walking that road today, I want you to know you're not walking alone. He's with you. Every foggy morning, every uncertain turn, every door that hasn't opened yet, he sees, he knows, and he's already waiting for you on the other side.
God doesn't show the whole map, just the next step. There's something unnerving about not knowing how the month will end, not knowing where your efforts are going, not knowing if the healing will ever come, or if the waiting's just wasted time in disguise. And yet not knowing, that's often where faith does its most sacred work. We don't always get to see the whole road, but we are always offered the next step. And that's the tension most of us live in, whether we admit it or not. We want a full map. We want blueprints. We want to be reassured that all the loss, all the heartbreak, all the slow mornings and sleepless nights will lead to something beautiful. But God doesn't work like Google Maps. He doesn't lay it all out before you start driving. Instead, he invites you into a different rhythm, a sacred, slower, more mysterious way of moving, one step at a time. And that's not just poetic, that's biblical. Think about Exodus 13. When God led the Israelites out of Egypt, he didn't give them a map. He gave them a cloud by day and fire by night. Guidance, yes, but only enough for the next stretch. They didn't know the whole route to the promised land. They didn't even know they'd be wandering for 40 years. They just knew they had to keep following the cloud, keep walking when it moved, keep stopping when it paused. That's the kind of faith God still calls us into today. The psalmist wrote, "Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path." Psalm 119, 105. Not a spotlight, not a floodlight that reveals miles ahead. Just a lamp, enough light for the next few steps. Enough to keep you from tripping. Enough to make you trust the one who walks beside you, even when the horizon is hidden. I once heard a preacher say, if God gave you the full picture, you'd either run ahead without him or be too afraid to move at all. And maybe that's why he doesn't show you the whole plan. Because faith is not knowing everything and still going, still trusting, still waking up and saying, "All right, Lord, I'll follow you into this unknown." There's something holy about that kind of surrender, something defiant in choosing to move without certainty. To say, even if I don't see the whole staircase, I'll climb the first step. As Martin Luther King Jr. once said, faith is taking the first step, even when you don't see the whole staircase. And the truth is, most of us never will. Not in this life, but what you will see over time is how faithful God has been. You'll look back and realize that the closed door was actually protection, that the delayed answer was preparation, that the person who left made space for someone who would stay, that the year you thought was wasted became the soil for something you never imagined growing. But none of that insight comes while you're walking forward. It only comes in hindsight. So today's calling, it's not to understand, it's to obey, to take that next step. And I know that next step can be terrifying, especially when you're walking through fog, especially when you've been hurt before, especially when nothing in your life feels like it's adding up. You might be tempted to freeze, to wait until it all makes sense. But friend, the clarity you're craving won't come from sitting still. It will come from stepping out. There's a woman I met whose story still echoes in my heart whenever I talk about faith in the unknown. Her name is Lucia, and she lives in Seville, Spain. She's 44 now, with quiet strength in her voice and tired kindness in her eyes. A few years ago, she was working in a textile factory. She'd worked there for almost 20 years, stitching clothes on long nights and early mornings to support her daughter. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, familiar. It made sense. Then, without warning, the factory shut down. Global demand, outsourcing, the usual story. Lucia found herself at home, jobless, staring at cracked tiles in her kitchen, unsure how she'd afford next month's groceries. She applied everywhere, supermarkets, cafes, retail stores. No one was hiring. She began to pray, not long, poetic prayers, but short, desperate ones. Señor, muéstrame el camino. Lord, show me the way. One morning, while folding laundry, she heard an ad on the radio for a vocational center looking for instructors. It didn't click right away. She didn't see herself as a teacher, but the ad kept echoing in her head. The next day, she walked past the center on her way to the market. She paused, looked at the door, and kept walking. 2 days later, she went back and asked if they needed help with anything, even janitorial work. When they found out she'd been a seamstress for 2 decades, they invited her to volunteer with their beginner sewing class, just for a few weeks, no promises. That was 5 years ago. Today, Lucia runs a program at that same center, teaching sewing and textile work to immigrant women, many of whom don't speak much Spanish and have never held a job before. She teaches them not just to sew, but to believe again, to believe in new beginnings, in purpose, in the dignity of their hands. Lucia never planned any of this. She didn't see the whole staircase. She just took the next step. And somehow, God unfolded a life she never would have dared to dream. I remember asking her once, "What made you go back to that center the second time?" She paused for a long moment and said, "I just felt that if I didn't follow that little pull in my heart, I'd regret it." Then she added with a soft laugh, "God doesn't shout at me. He just nudges, and I try to listen when he does." That's it, isn't it? That's the kind of faith that changes lives. Not because it's loud or dramatic, but because it's responsive. Because it moves, even when it doesn't understand. So if you're in a season right now where nothing makes sense, or you're waiting for clarity before you move, let me speak this into your soul. Clarity is not a prerequisite for obedience. Sometimes clarity only comes after obedience. The peace you're waiting for might not come before the step. It might be waiting on the other side of it. And what if the next step God is asking you to take isn't even big? What if it's as small as picking up the phone, sending the email, applying again, forgiving the person, saying yes to something that terrifies you or no to something that's been draining you? What if the next step isn't changing your whole life, but simply changing your posture toward it? Sometimes the most powerful prayer you can whisper is, "God, I don't need the whole plan. Just show me the next part." And when he does, even in a whisper, even in a tug, follow it. There's a verse in Isaiah that says, "Whether you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, 'This is the way, walk in it.'" Isaiah 30:21. That voice still speaks, still guides, but it requires stillness to hear it and courage to act on it. Lucia didn't hear thunder. She didn't have a vision. She heard a radio ad and felt a pull, and it changed everything. You don't need to be certain to move. You don't need to feel brave to begin. You only need to say, "Yes, Lord. If you lead, I'll follow." And maybe you're afraid that if you move, you'll fall, that you'll choose the wrong door, that you'll take the wrong path. But I need you to know this, and not just know it in your head, but believe it in your bones. God is bigger than your mistakes. He's a redeemer. That's who he is. And if you step out in faith, and it's not the perfect path, he will reroute, he will restore, he will redirect. He's not limited by your wrong turns. Think of Jonah. He ran, and God still brought him back. Think of Peter. He denied, and Jesus still called him Rock. Think of the prodigal son. He wandered, and the father still ran to meet him. So even if your next step isn't perfect, take it. Take it anyway. God's grace is not fragile. It can hold you. You don't need to see 5 years ahead. You just need to take one step in trust. Then another, and slowly, the fog will clear. Not all at once, but enough. Enough for you to keep moving. Enough for you to grow stronger. Enough for you to one day look back and say, I didn't know where I was going, but I knew who I was following. That's what walking by faith really is. It's not about being fearless. It's about being willing. Willing to move without certainty. Willing to act without applause. Willing to trust that God sees what you don't. That He goes ahead of you, clearing paths you haven't reached yet. That He stands behind you, protecting what you've already walked through. That He walks beside you, even in your trembling. So today, if the next step looks small, take it. If the next step feels risky, take it. If the next step is covered in fog, take it anyway. Because you're not stepping into nothing. You're stepping into grace, into divine timing, into the arms of a God who has never, not once, let go of you. One step. That's all He's asking. Not 10, not the whole journey. Just one. He'll handle the rest.
Even the silence is part of the answer. There's a particular kind of ache that comes not from what is said, but from what isn't. A long pause in a conversation, a message left unread, a prayer that floats upward but never seems to echo back. Silence can feel like the loudest rejection, not because it shouts anything cruel, but because it withholds the comfort of clarity. And when that silence comes from God, it can leave you wondering whether He's listening at all. But here's the hard and holy truth. God's silence is not the same as God's absence. Just because heaven feels quiet doesn't mean heaven has turned its face from you. In fact, some of the most powerful work God does happens beneath the surface, behind the scenes, within the stillness. When Jesus heard that His friend Lazarus was sick, He didn't rush to heal him. He waited, and in that waiting, His friends, Martha, Mary, must have felt betrayed, abandoned, confused. The very one they believed could save didn't come in time, and yet the silence wasn't apathy. It was preparation. Jesus wasn't being slow. He was being intentional. He wasn't too late. He was perfectly timed to reveal something deeper than healing, resurrection. John 11. So if today you're in a place where your prayers feel like unanswered voicemails in a spiritual void, I want to remind you that God does some of His most profound work in the quiet. Silence doesn't mean He's inactive. It means He's close, often closer than you realize. But that's not always easy to believe when you're in it. I remember someone once said, if God is silent, it's because He's trusting you to walk with what He already told you. That line stayed with me because so often we crave new answers, new directions, new signs. But maybe the silence is inviting us to revisit the last word we did hear. Maybe it's less about what we haven't received and more about what we haven't obeyed. The silence of God can feel like being stranded, but in truth it is often a sacred space, a place where faith is purified, where we stop depending on signs and start depending on His character. I think of what the prophet Isaiah wrote in chapter 45. Truly, you are a God who hides Himself. That's not a line people like to put on coffee mugs or frame on their walls, but it's true. God sometimes hides, not to hurt, but to draw us deeper, to shift us from seeking answers to seeking Him. There's a man I met whose story has helped me understand this better. not because he escaped silence, but because he learned to live inside it. His name is Nico, and he lives in Helsinki, Finland. He's 28 now, tall and soft-spoken with a quiet presence that carries more gravity than his years suggest. A few years ago, he was a rising star in the startup world. Bright mind, fast talker. He launched a tech platform designed to help small businesses automate their logistics, and within months he had investors, media attention, and what looked like a golden runway. But then came the cracks, a delayed launch, a critical security flaw, a major investor who pulled out just before a key funding round. Within 10 months, it was all gone. He was broke, burnt out, and disoriented. And what hurt the most wasn't the failure, it was the silence. He had prayed before every meeting, thanked God in every win, dedicated his platform to a higher purpose. But when it all fell apart, all he could hear was nothing. No comforting voice, no clarity, just long, sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, whispering questions into a God who didn't seem to be answering. He didn't go to church for a while, said it felt hollow. But he didn't walk away from God either. Instead, he began writing, nothing formal, just short journal entries each morning, a sentence or two, sometimes a prayer, sometimes a question, sometimes just silence on paper. Months passed. He didn't feel better, but he kept showing up, to the page, to life, to the silence. And slowly something began to shift, not outside him, inside. His prayers stopped being demands and became conversations. His faith stopped hinging on outcomes and began rooting in presence. He started publishing those morning entries online, not to impress anyone, but to be honest. A few hundred people read them, then a few thousand. Eventually, a publisher contacted him and asked if he'd be open to compiling them. That journal became a book. The book became a voice for thousands who had felt alone in the silence of their own walk with God. I asked him once if he ever got the answers he was praying for back when everything fell apart. He smiled and said, "No, but I found peace in the not knowing. That's enough." And I think that's what the silence of God is often about, not withholding, but deepening. Teaching us that peace isn't found in understanding everything. It's found in trusting someone bigger than our understanding. There's this line from Tony Evans that comes to mind. When you're down to nothing, God is up to something. That sounds simple, maybe even too neat, but I think it points to something real, that our emptiness is not the end of the story. It's often the space God uses to write a new one. Sometimes we treat silence as a verdict, a divine no. But what if it's not a no, just a not yet? What if God's silence is not Him ignoring you, but Him inviting you? What if it's the soil where patience grows, where discernment deepens, where character is formed? Think about how many moments in Scripture are marked by silence. The 400 years between Malachi and Matthew. The 3 days Jesus lay in the tomb. The night before his crucifixion, when even the stars must have felt indifferent. Silence is not a mistake in the divine story. It's part of the rhythm. And when you're walking through it, it's okay to grieve, to ask, to wonder, but don't walk away. If your season feels like God has gone quiet, I want you to know, the silence is sacred. You are not being punished. You are being invited into a deeper place of intimacy, one where you stop asking, "Why is this happening?" and start asking, "Who is walking with me through it?" That shift changes everything, because when you remember who is walking with you, even in silence, you stop needing all the answers. You start craving presence over proof, surrender over certainty. Nico didn't get his company back, but he found something more lasting, a way of living that isn't dictated by results, but grounded in relationship. His success was buried, and from that burial, something new was planted. Maybe your silence is doing that too. I once heard someone say, the teacher is always silent during the test. And maybe that's true of God too. Not because he's cruel, but because he's watching carefully, lovingly, to see if we'll trust what we already know when the reassurance isn't loud. That's what real faith is. It's not proven in answered prayers. It's proven in unanswered ones. In the mornings when you still show up to pray. In the decisions you make from integrity, even when no one sees. In the nights you lay awake, exhausted but still whispering, I trust you. That's holy ground. That's the kind of faith that heaven applauds. And here's what I want you to remember. The silence won't last forever. Just like winter gives way to spring. Just like Good Friday gave way to Easter. Just like tombs don't stay sealed. This season of silence has an end. And when it breaks, when the voice returns, when the answer arrives, it won't just be an answer. It will be a resurrection. It will be clarity, yes. But more than that, it will be transformation. You won't be the same. And that's the point. So if today you're walking through silence, keep walking. If the prayers are echoing into emptiness, keep praying. If the sky feels shut and your heart feels raw, keep trusting. Because even the silence is part of the answer, and the one you're waiting on has never stopped working. He's just not done yet.
God sees what you can't. Trust his vision. There are moments in life when all we can see is what's right in front of us. And sometimes that view is nothing but rubble, disappointment, closed doors, plans that didn't work out, prayers that didn't get the answer we hoped for. We try to piece it together, but it doesn't make sense. It feels like holding a handful of puzzle pieces from a picture we've never seen, and we cry out to God, why this piece? Why this shape? Why now? But what if it's not meant to make sense yet? What if the vision isn't broken? It's just unfinished. There's a peace that comes when we stop trying to see the whole picture and start trusting the artist. Because God sees what we don't. He holds the perspective we lack. And while we might be staring at ashes, he's already holding the blueprint for beauty. The prophet Jeremiah records these words from the Lord. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. Jeremiah 1:5. That's not poetic language. That's divine intention. God didn't stumble into your life. He designed it, which means even what feels like failure is still being held in his hands. Even the delay, even the loss, even the detour you didn't ask for, none of it caught him off guard. But we don't see that in the moment. When the marriage starts to fracture, when the promotion goes to someone else, when the child you prayed for drifts further away, it's hard to believe that any of it is part of a plan. And we begin to ask the questions we've all whispered in the dark. Did I miss something? Did I take the wrong turn? Is this where it ends? And that's where trust has to speak louder than clarity. Christine Kane once said, "What you see is temporary. What God sees is eternal." That's the difference between our perspective and his. We're looking at seconds. He's looking at centuries. We're looking at this moment. He's looking at eternity. And what feels like a dead end to us might just be a pivot point in his hands. I think of Jean-Paul, 61 years old, a quiet man from a small town outside Bordeaux, France. He worked with his hands his whole life, a craftsman, shaping wood into beauty. For decades, he built furniture, repaired heirlooms, carved detail into cathedral doors. But as demand for handmade work faded, so did his clients. The orders slowed, the workshops closed, And Jean-Paul, who had given his life to a trade that once gave him purpose, found himself alone in a shed filled with dust and tools no one wanted. He didn't complain. He just stopped waking up early, stopped cleaning the wood shavings off his workbench, started drinking more tea and talking less. His daughter, worried, tried to encourage him to volunteer at a local school, but he shrugged it off. "What could I teach anyone that matters now?" he said. "The world has moved on." But one Sunday after Mass, a priest asked if he'd consider helping out with a special project, building a simple cross for a children's retreat. Jean-Paul agreed. He spent the next 2 weeks cutting and shaping the wood. Not because it was a big deal, but because it was the first thing someone had asked him to do in months. When he delivered the cross, one of the children, a boy with a speech delay, walked up and ran his hands along the grain. Then he looked at Jean-Paul and whispered, "It's the most beautiful cross I've ever seen." That was all he said. But something cracked open in Jean-Paul's chest that day. That single moment led to another. The retreat leader asked if Jean-Paul could come back to teach the kids how to make small wooden rosary holders. Then a special needs teacher asked if he could show a group of teens how to sand and polish. Week by week, his workshop filled again. Not with paying customers, but with students, laughter, and stories. His hands, once growing stiff from disuse, were active again. His voice, once quieted by irrelevance, began to carry new authority. Years later, when I visited that small town for a retreat, I saw a group of teens standing around Jean-Paul, listening intently as he told them the history of a particular type of oak. He caught my eye, smiled, and said quietly, "Turns out God wasn't done with me. I was just looking in the wrong direction." He thought his purpose was over, but God saw what he couldn't. The impact his gift could still make, the heart still waiting to be shaped by the work of his hands. All it took was a small yes, and a willingness to believe that maybe, just maybe, the end wasn't the end. And that's what I want to remind you of today. What feels like loss might be redirection. What feels like the end might be the doorway to your real beginning. What feels like silence from God might be Him turning the page to a chapter you never would have written on your own. But for that to happen, you have to trust the vision you can't yet see. You have to trust that God is not building your life on accident, that the detours aren't punishment, they're protection, that the doors that didn't open were never meant to, that the place you've landed, no matter how unfamiliar, is not outside the reach of God's plan. When you were a child, maybe you remember sitting in the back seat while someone else drove. You didn't know the roads. You couldn't read the signs. You didn't understand why they took that long way, or made that unexpected turn, or stopped when you were so close to your destination. But you didn't panic because you trusted the driver. That's what faith looks like now. You're not in the driver's seat. You never were. But you are safe. Not because you know the route, but because you know the one steering. God sees the mountain you're about to climb and the view at the top. He sees the heartbreak that's about to heal, the relationship that's about to be restored, the opportunity that's about to unfold, the strength that's growing inside you right now in this very moment of waiting. He sees it all. And even more than that, He sees you, not just as you are, but as you're becoming. You may feel invisible in this season. You may feel like you're falling behind while everyone else is racing ahead. You may feel like nothing you do matters. But God is not measuring your life by metrics. He's watching your heart. He's watching your trust. He's shaping you with patience, with precision, with mercy. Isaiah 55 reminds us that God's thoughts are not our thoughts, and His ways are not our ways. As high as the heavens are above the earth, so much higher are His ways than ours. Which means, thank God. We don't have to understand everything to be held by Him. And isn't that a relief? To know that your security doesn't rest on your ability to predict the future. It rests on the goodness of the one who already holds it. So if all you see today is what's missing, what's lost, what didn't go to plan, I invite you to lift your eyes a little higher. Maybe the vision you had wasn't wrong. Maybe it just wasn't full yet. Maybe God is still layering pieces together, aligning people and timing and provision in ways that are invisible to you now, but will one day make your jaw drop. He's not a careless artist. He doesn't waste brushstrokes. Everything He allows, He uses. Everything He removes, He replaces. Everything He prunes, He intends to make bloom again. Jean-Paul thought his best years were behind him. He thought his usefulness had expired, but in God's economy, purpose doesn't expire. It gets repurposed, redirected, redeemed. And if that's true for him, it's true for you too. Maybe the question isn't, God, what's next? Maybe the better question is, God, what do you see that I don't? And then comes the harder part, being willing to follow, even when the view is limited. Because He sees the harvest in your waiting, the breakthrough in your burden, the glory that will rise from your ashes. And when the time is right, when your heart is ready and the world is in place, He will show you why this path was necessary, why the silence had weight, why the delay had design, why the story had to unfold just the way it did. So take heart. Don't be discouraged by what you can't see. Don't let confusion convince you that God is confused. He is not. He never has been. You might be standing in the middle of a mess, but He sees the masterpiece. You might be walking through fog, but He sees the mountain. You might be counting losses, but He's preparing a legacy. You don't need to see it to believe it. You just need to trust the one who does. Keep walking, even with tears in your eyes. Some walks feel holy, like you're surrounded by light, clarity, open doors, and answered prayers. And then there are the other walks, the long ones, the lonely ones. The nights when you kneel beside your bed with a heart too tired to form words. The mornings when you drive in silence because even the radio feels too loud for your ache. The afternoons when everyone else seems to be winning at life while you're just trying to stay afloat. Those are the walks that test you, and those are the walks that shape you. It's one thing to walk by faith when you feel strong. It's another to keep walking when your knees shake, when your heart aches, when your eyes blur with tears that no one sees. But here's the truth. Those steps, the quiet ones, the painful ones, the stubborn ones, they count the most. Psalm 126 says, "Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy." That's not just a poetic sentiment. That's a promise. It means God sees every tear that hits the ground. He sees every step you take with trembling. He collects it all, not to shame you, but to redeem it. I met a woman years ago whose story still lingers with me. Her name is Aisha, and she lives in Nairobi, Kenya. When I met her, she was 36, raising 3 children on her own. Her husband had died in a tragic motorcycle accident just 6 months earlier. One moment, they were laughing over dinner. The next, she was answering a call that would change her life. Grief came like a flood. Not just the emotional kind, but the financial, the social, the spiritual kind. In a matter of days, she had to figure out rent, school fees, groceries, and how to breathe without breaking. And through it all, people kept saying things like, "Stay strong. God gives His toughest battles to His strongest soldiers. You'll be okay." But she wasn't okay. Not for a long time. There were mornings she'd sit on the edge of her bed, staring at the floor for hours. Even getting dressed felt impossible. she told me she would whisper one line over and over: God, I don't know what to do, but help me not give up. And slowly, with no great miracle, no thunder from heaven, no overnight change, she got up. She packed school lunches. She went to the market. She walked her children to church. She answered emails. She wiped her tears on her children's noses and the kitchen counters, all while wondering if she'd ever feel whole again. One day, while cooking dinner, her youngest daughter came into the kitchen and asked, "Mama, how come you smile even when I know you're sad?" Aisha paused. Then she said, "Because even sad people can have hope." That sentence became the heartbeat of her recovery. She began writing those little truths down. Sentences like that. Simple, human, honest. She taped them to her wall. One day a neighbor asked if she'd write. One for her too. Then a friend of a friend asked. Before long, she was writing small notes of encouragement on index cards and handing them out at her church. Little seeds, she called them. Tiny hope for tired hearts. 2 years later, she started a small nonprofit that distributes handwritten notes and meals to grieving families across Nairobi. No fame, no spotlight, just quiet love from someone who knows the walk. And I asked her once, "How did you get from there to here?" She looked down at her hands and said, "I never stopped walking, even when all I had were tears." That's it. That's what walking by faith really looks like. Not perfection, not constant strength, not smiling through everything. It looks like showing up when you're exhausted, saying yes when you're scared, whispering, "God, I trust you." So even when everything in you wants to give up, you don't need to be a hero. You don't need to feel brave every day. You don't need to pretend you're not hurting. You just need to keep walking. Because here's what I know with all my heart. The walk through the valley is not the end of your story. There is still joy for you, still beauty, still redemption, still laughter you haven't laughed yet, still songs you haven't sung, still mornings that will feel light again, still strength you haven't discovered, still people you haven't met, still a purpose that's unfolding even now, one step at a time. God is not done with you. Your pain is not the period at the end of your sentence. It's a comma. And after that comma, grace continues the story. You may not feel it now. That's okay. Faith isn't a feeling. It's a choice, a surrender, a walk. So walk anyway. With tears in your eyes, with shaking hands, with a tired heart, walk anyway. Because the God who walks with you is not judging you for stumbling. He's cheering you on for staying in motion. And he's not waiting for you to be strong before he meets you. He meets you right here in the middle of your weakness. And you're not behind. You're not broken beyond repair. You're not disqualified. You are beloved and you are becoming. Every painful step is not a detour. It's part of the path. Every silent night is not a punishment, it's sacred ground. Every tear you've cried is not wasted, it is seen, it is held. So if no one has said it to you in a while, let me say it now. You're doing better than you think. The walk is hard, but you're still walking. That alone is holy. And even if no one claps for you today, heaven does. When the road still feels long, I want to leave you with this. Sometimes the people walking closest to God don't look victorious. They look tired. Their clothes are dusty. Their prayers are hoarse. Their pace is slow, but they keep going. And that matters more than we know. Maybe you've been measuring your life by progress you can't see. Milestones you haven't reached, breakthroughs that haven't come. But don't forget, your walk isn't about applause. It's about obedience. It's not about how fast you move. It's about who you're following. So even when you can't see the way forward, even when the horizon is blurry and the path is uneven, keep walking. Not because you feel strong, but because you are held. Not because you know the plan, but because you trust the heart behind it. And in the spirit of this journey, I'll leave you with something I wrote for you. A quiet motto to carry in your pocket on the hard days. Faith isn't walking without tears. It's walking anyway, because you believe love is still leading you. That love has a name, and his name is Jesus. He walked before you. He walks beside you, and he's waiting at the finish line, arms wide open. So take the next step, and when it hurts, pause, cry, breathe, but then keep going. Because grace is not found at the destination. It walks with you the whole way home.